Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the York Festival of Ideas. My name is Dr. Carla Evans, and I'll be chairing the event of this evening. Thank you all for joining us, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you all here. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speakers this evening, Karen Bartlett and Anisa Dhanji. Karen is the author of the book we are discussing tonight and is a writer and journalist contributing to The Times, Wired, Newsweek, Time, and the BBC. She was formerly the director of a leading campaign group for democracy and human rights and is the author of 5 other nonfiction books. The Escape from Kabul, a true story of sisterhood and defiance, is the book we will be discussing tonight. The Escape from Kabul recounts the events of August 2021, when the women judges of Afghanistan and their families faced mortal danger. Karen is here today to speak to us along with one judge that was involved in this incredible effort, Anisa Dhanji. And to start off, I wanted to have Karen and Anisa introduce themselves and introduce this amazing book before we go on and do a panel discussion. Karen, Anisa, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Carla. I think you did an excellent introduction there. I first heard about this story, like everyone else, in August 2021. It was really in the news that there was a big campaign to try and evacuate the Afghan women judges, led by the International Bar Association and Anisa and the International Association of Women Judges. And then we didn't hear any more about what had happened to these women and had they been able to get out. And Anisa and I started communicating about what had happened and the evacuation effort. And I learned about the amazing work that Anisa and all her colleagues and other women had done to work with Afghan women judges and help them get out of Afghanistan and resettle in other countries. But I really wanted to not only that story about the evacuation itself, but also to record for the history books the story of the Afghan women themselves. It occurred to me that in a few years, no one might know what Afghan women judges had done. So I wanted to make sure that we had a record of who they were, what their lives had been like, the work that they'd done, the changes that they'd brought, and then also to talk about, what had happened to them afterwards and some of the struggles that they faced in sort of resettling in other countries. And Anisa was fantastic, and we've talked about this ever since. And she made a huge contribution to making the book happen.
Well, Karen is very generous as always, and we are absolutely indebted to her because when the work of evacuating the Afghan women judges started, it was very much all hands on deck. And there was no thought given, really. I'm not sure we would have had the space in our heads to think about it at that time, about how this would look like in retrospect, and how important it was to capture the story. And we're hugely indebted to Karen for finding her way through to us, and then for making sense of the deluge of messages that were simply forwarded to her. Things were happening in real time in different time zones, and it can't have been easy to piece it all together. But more than that, more than telling the story about the evacuation, the book tells a story about their lives prior to this happening. And that is, I think, a huge service as well, because they really had enormous task to serve as judges in a climate that was not particularly hospitable to women judges, and then telling the story about what happened to them after they arrived in other countries as refugees, and how they picked themselves up to settle in new environments and forge a life for themselves and their and their families. So, as I said, a huge debt to Karen. If I'm looking a little bit distracted, it's because my dog has chosen this moment to start climbing on me. And as soon as I have a moment, I'll banish him into another room, in which case you'll hear him barking. There are many advantages of Zoom, and this is one of the disadvantages, I'm afraid. He demands constant attention, and if I forget for a moment, then he has a way of reminding me. So that's, I suppose, what I would say by way of introduction to myself and to the dog.
Yeah. So let's delve a little bit more into the book and actually what is in the book. So let's start from the beginning. So as you nicely write, for 2 decades, these women, these brave judges, were the face of the new Afghanistan judicial system. And I was wondering, how quickly did these legal roles that they performed turn them into targets? And when the prisons were open, how quickly did this happen? I mean, could you give us a timeline of when they came in and how quickly were these women exposed and came into danger?
Well, Afghanistan had had women for a long time, since 1969.
Mm.
So two of the judges in the book had actually been judges before the Taliban came to power the first time. Then during the Taliban's first reign, they were banished and they had to live in hiding and do other things. And then immediately after 9/11, when NATO occupied the country, those women came back and they were very quick to immediately take up their positions as judges again. And then you had a whole generation of young women who were suddenly trained to become judges and enter the judiciary. And the changes they brought about in those years were amazing. I mean, they were really at the forefront of changing the law regarding human rights and women's rights and children's rights in Afghanistan. And they were always in incredible danger. They tended to always be sent to the most dangerous provinces, the most dangerous courts. They faced mortal danger for the whole time that they were working. So they were very idealistic and admirable women. And gradually they talked about in the book about, as those years progressed, the security situation deteriorated in Afghanistan. So the dangers became more and more intense. And the book really starts with the terrible events of January 2021, when 2 women judges were assassinated on their way to court, on their way to work. And that's where we pick up the relationship between the Afghan women judges and Anisa and the international women judges. When they started to realize too that their colleagues in Afghanistan were in danger. And Anisa, I think you can tell everyone a little bit more about that period.
Sure. The Afghan women judges had formed, with support from the International Association of Women Judges, an association of women judges of their own, the Afghan Women Judges Association. And through that, we had contact with them. There'd been some exchanges. There'd been some judges from Afghanistan who'd gone to the States, for example, 1 or 2 from the States who went to Afghanistan. There was already a relationship. There were already friendships. So these were by no means strangers when the events of 2001 started to unfold. But certainly our contact with them increased in the months following. And in June of 21, they had their own meeting in which we participated by Zoom. And to the last woman, the message was, please tell the world that, our work is important. We want to stay. We don't want to leave. We need people to understand that the risks are real and, please do something. But the something was not, find a way out for us. There was real determination, as Karen's book outlines, on the part of these women to make a difference. They were, for the first time, in Afghanistan, courts for violence against women. For the first time, domestic abuse was being taken seriously. So they were doing important work. They had seen the progress, and they were not minded at all to give it up. This was June 2021, and at that time, I think the world was thinking we still had another 6 months before the Taliban, had a realistic prospect of taking over. That, of course, was not a sound, expectation. They took over very quickly in August, the middle of August 2021, and it happened very, very fast. Judges had gone to work that day and received calls to say, the Taliban are at the gates. Go home. They were, ordered by their superiors to leave immediately. And one judge, for example, who I was in contact with, left court in a car, which she was driving. Unusually, she was allowed to drive, but anyway. And suddenly she was surrounded by people. She didn't know whether they were the Afghan security forces, whether they were the Taliban, because what separates them sometimes is just a uniform. Yeah. Somebody changes a uniform and you don't know which side they're on. And she didn't know until I told her on the phone that day that, the main prison in Kabul had been opened. And that's the first time I'd been in contact with this judge for some time, both before and since, but that's the first time she ever broke down. The consequences was not just from the Taliban, but from the people they had imprisoned. And suddenly these people were all free. And so, we had a discussion about whether she should go home or not go home, because the other thing that happened that we found out about before they did, because, they were on the move, is that the Supreme Court building had been effectively, broken into, and all their names and addresses were out there for everyone, and telephone numbers were out there for everyone to find. And that, caused obviously a lot of concern, a lot of anxiety, and the business about the telephone numbers being out there caused difficulties for weeks to come. They would get phone calls from people, and they didn't know who these people were. Some people offering help. They didn't know who they could trust, who they couldn't trust. It was an incredibly difficult time for them, and it happened very, very fast. There was no time to catch their breath. Some went home, some didn't go home, some went to relatives' houses, but of course they might be putting the relatives in danger. It was a very fraught period, and we were having to sift through some of the calls to say, look, don't follow these instructions, don't go to where they're telling you to go, give us the number, we will check them out. But they were suddenly incredibly vulnerable.
Wow, that is harrowing. The psychological pressure and terror these people experienced, it's hard to fathom. Karen describes in the book a decentralized network of the female lawyers, one of them is you, Anisa, operating from their kitchens. Why did the Western governments fail so utterly at that civilians had to build their own evacuation infrastructure? Why do you think that happened? Can you tell us a little bit more? How did the system break down? These judges were kind of the backbone for the new Afghanistan and for the future. So what happened, do you think?
Before Anisa tells you something very serious about that, I just want to say that these women were not just in their kitchens. They were in their bedrooms, in their bathrooms, in their pajamas. There's a lovely sense of sisterhood about this book, and women who are very professional, banding together and acting in unusual ways. Sorry, Anisa, over to you.
No, not at all. Karen, this was so unplanned, but if it had been planned, I don't know that we could have planned it a lot better, because the people who came together were from different countries and different time zones. And in the early months, particularly, it was very much round the clock. So the fact that somebody was always awake was important, and it became important also in terms of the countries where these women judges ended up. So in our core group, we had two from the US, one from Canada, one from Spain, myself from the UK, and Australia and New Zealand. And these are the countries that ended up taking the bulk of the judges. And so the supports we were able to put in place after they arrived was also, tied to the fact that we were based in these countries. But I would be, lying if I said this was all carefully planned. It wasn't. It was really just starting to work, and it just took organic shape. To answer the question about why governments didn't step up, there was a feeling, and I think it may be captured in Karen's book because it's something we used to say. We thought we just had to bring the problem to the world's attention and somebody would act. And it came as a real shock when we discovered that actually nobody had any intention of doing anything. Why? Very much a function, no doubt, of the completely unplanned, chaotic way in which we withdrew from Afghanistan. There was no time. You know how much equipment, for example, military equipment, was left in Afghanistan, and the initial effort was to evacuate for the coalition to evacuate its own people, and then whoever got through to the right people at the right time. Our first judges to come out went to Poland, and that was only because somebody who wasn't part of our group, a wonderful woman lawyer in Poland on holiday, was listening to this story unfold, and her reaction was, not on my watch is this going to be happening. And she made some phone calls and got somebody senior in Poland to listen to her. And we had to get the judges to write P on their hands to show it at the gate where there were tens of thousands of people gathered. It was that random and that chaotic. And so it has been ever since, although, we've got a reasonable number of judges out. We started with about 250, there are about 35 left. So we've got a fair number out. It's been literally 1-2 families at a time. It's been hard work every single time. And the focus has been, let's try and get this next family out. Let's try and get this next family out. There's been no master plan, no government that stepped in and said, we'll take 30 of your judges, let's divvy this up between different countries. All of those things were tried. Nobody was interested.
But not even now. I mean,
Not
it's still
even
an
now.
issue, right?
Not even now.
Not even now.
Not even now.
So, I mean,
I think it's getting harder for you, Anisa.
It is. It's getting considerably harder. So we've got 3 judges at the moment who've got, in theory, they've got permission to come to the UK. Again, how those permissions are granted is entirely random. And we'd been waiting for some months trying to persuade the UK authorities to evacuate them from Afghanistan. When I say we can't actually do anything directly, separation of powers and so forth. So they had lawyers appointed and they were the ones pressing for it. And then about 3 weeks ago, maybe 4 weeks ago, the UK decided they were not going to evacuate anyone from Afghanistan directly. Get thyself to a third country was the message. You can't now go to Iran. Pakistan is pretty much out of the question. And we're looking at them going to Tajikistan, and countries are opportunistic. The visas for Tajikistan, prices have suddenly gone up. To get one family out is probably going to cost us about $7,000 or $8,000 just in dollars in visas. And the door feels like it's closing all the time. We have a window now and we may lose that. And if we lose that, then these judges stay in Afghanistan.
So how did you go about, I'm curious, finances are a big issue. I mean, you volunteer your time and effort, but there are, money has to be paid, as you said, for these visas. How do you have a special group then that fundraises? I assume the countries are not paying up or financing this.
It's been patchy. There was a time, as Karen sets out in her book, that IBA the International Bar Association chartered a couple of planes to get people out. And that was a huge help. Other than that, it's been random. You know, we cannot, as certainly in the UK, as judges, we cannot fundraise. So, you know, a lot of times we're trying to do things with our hands tied behind our backs. We've got one in our group, US based, who's just been phenomenal at getting money. It's not always required money. The Holy Grail has more often than not been visas. Yeah. We've got to get countries to agree to take them. Right now, we're facing the money issue because the UK has decided to do what it's decided to do, but it's not always taken money. So if Germany has agreed to take a certain number of people or a couple of families or whatever, then they will do the flights for those people after they've passed the biometrics and they've passed this. But of course, you've got to leave Afghanistan to get processed, and you've got to wait in a third country, and that can be indefinite. And whether or not that country will support you while you're there or not is another matter. So we've had to pay stipends to support people for periods of time. It's been a patchwork. We've dealt with the problem in front of us when we've had the problem in front of us.
I was wondering, Karen, how do you, in your interviews with the network, how did they face this impossible question of the triage system with the limit, as Anisa mentioned, there's a limited number of visas. You had to decide who goes, who has to say, who is more in danger. How did the network do with this? How, in your interviews with the network, how did they deal psychologically with it, but also how did they decide? Did they have a system of triage, or it was just kind of haphazard?
Well, I don't believe it was haphazard. Anisa can probably tell you in detail how the people were prioritized.
Okay.
But obviously, I know it is a big question of who gets to stay and who leaves first, and then the feelings of those judges who left first and their sort of relief at leaving, but also guilt at leaving people behind, which is another huge psychological issue. So yeah, it's very complicated.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit more, Anissa, about
Sure.
you come up with a system? It's a tough one.
So when we started, we didn't have a database of all of these judges, their specific roles, their ethnicity, and we had to start compiling that pretty quickly. We probably started that work in July, but were by no means ready when things collapsed in the middle of August. And then the people whose support we needed to continue that work were themselves now in great danger. And, it was difficult to ask them to dedicate the time that they had been willing before. But we knew that the first group we had to focus on were the Hazaras. They're an ethnic group who the Taliban had targeted before. And they were, I mean, when I say targeted, I mean massacred. And there was every reason to believe that they would do so again, as indeed they started to. So our first judges out were Hazara judges. And then we had some senior judges who we thought would be most at risk. So there was focus on them. But it was not entirely systematic. Sometimes it was, look, we can take a nuclear family out because some countries will only allow families that fit their definition of family. So parents and children under the age of 18, never mind that doesn't fit the Afghan definition of family. And sometimes there wasn't time to debate that, argue that, negotiate that. And sometimes it was, a family was high risk, but they wouldn't leave without someone or the other, a sister-in-law who might be single. And so everything was one at a time. And we made the best decisions we could. but they were not always objectively decisions based on who was most at risk. Sometimes it was, these are the spaces we have. We have one space for one nuclear family. Can we do this? And they needed passports. No passport, no travel. There was a time when we could get people out without passports, but that became more difficult. And if somebody in the family, if there was a family with passports and somebody's passport had expired, or one, newborn didn't have a passport, that decision was made because the family was not going to leave without that child. So, a fair amount of work was spent trying to get the judges' passports, but not all of them came through in time. And, we just had to work with what we had. It was very imperfect.
There's quite a lot of detail in the book about different aspects of that. So, for example, one of the American judges, Patricia Whale, her son actually built your database, which was a huge undertaking. Farah, the translator, who did so many thousands of hours of work, she talks about the practicalities of trying to get that information to the judges. How to tell judges who couldn't use their iPhone how to drop a pin to show their location. How a judge couldn't get a photo for her visa form because, Anisa and the judges assumed, well, you take the photo on your phone. But no, this lady had to go to a photo studio. The photo studio didn't have the electricity. They had to get a gas canister. So on and so on. The complications of all of this and the cultural differences were huge. It's really astonishing that anybody got out.
Yeah, absolutely. Many, many stories like that, which, highlight the randomness of some of these things, who got out, who didn't. And then, the first lot that got out, as I said, went to Poland. The next lot that got out went to Romania. And you might think, a huge sigh of relief that they've got out. But then when the next lot go to Canada or go to Spain, then suddenly the Romanians don't feel so thrilled with their lot, and wish they hadn't been evacuated so early. So complete randomness, really a lesson in how the big things in life are things you don't actually plan, they happen.
So, but their journey isn't finished once they're out, as Karen mentioned in the beginning. The book really doesn't end also at the runway of the airport. What does the status injury look like if you're Supreme Court family, if you're a family of a Supreme Court justice who is now struggling with, in a new country, as you said, strewn across the world from Romania, US, UK, other places, struggling with language barriers and working at, these entry-level jobs in these new countries. Tell us more. How does that look? How much of a war are they in still, even though out of Afghanistan?
Well, that's a really good question, because obviously the temptation was to end the book with them leaving Afghanistan and have a so-called happy ending. And I think there is, in a lot of their stories, hope and optimism and resilience, but not that sense of triumph, because, they have this huge sense of loss. They had incredibly meaningful careers, really sort of fundamental to their identity. And they lost that immediately. And then as the book talks about, going to countries like Poland, huge cultural barriers, language barriers, sense of isolation, and having to sort of find the resilience and think about how they rebuild their lives, and also face prejudice and discrimination as refugees.
So they are they in limbo, most of them, waiting for something to change, or are they being integrated into society? What are some of the experiences? Anisa and Karen, what have you heard Where are these, what is their future outside of Afghanistan?
Well, most of them have moved on since then.
Yeah.
And I think Anisa can probably give you a good overview of where they are and what they're doing.
Sure. So the bulk of them are in the US. This was pre-Trump. And for most of them, their status is okay. For a few of them, they're caught in limbo because they may have gone there as students, for example, and their future immigration position is not so secure. But for the most part, they're okay. Likewise in Canada, likewise in the UK, less certain in Germany. We have a number in Brazil who went in the expectation that they would eventually be able to move to the US. That door is now closed, so they are really struggling. The ones in New Zealand are okay. The ones in Australia are okay. In fact, our first judge has just got citizenship in a new country. That was in Australia a couple of days ago, which was, a cause for real celebration. For the most part, they have proved remarkably resilient. It's worth remembering that these are career judges, that is to say, they start off their career as judges, not as lawyers first. On the whole, they're younger. So this, they're still in their childbearing years. They're continuing to have children without, the support that they may have had in their home countries, but they're rebuilding their lives. Many of them have gone on to further studies, completed master's degrees, working in law firms, on their way to requalifying. It's not all good news. Clearly, some are struggling, but it is a lesson in resilience and determination. And, they are taking the opportunities that they have and that they can find. So the judges in Canada, in the English-speaking world, are doing probably better, understandably. Where they've got language barriers, it is harder. They're being supported by the local chapters, so the UK Association of Women Judges, the Canadian Association of Women Judges, and so forth. They're each partnered with a local judge, so with a Canadian judge or with a UK judge, to provide that sort of level of one-to-one guidance and one-to-one support. As you might expect, some relationships have been great and really helpful, some less so. But they're making their way. It's not an even picture across the board, but lots of cause for hope and optimism, and some sadder stories.
Yeah. What about what is the current situation for the female legal professionals that are still trapped and hiding under Taliban today? Do you have, I assume the Met Network still is
Yeah.
kind of has a touch
Sure.
in.
So the legal profession is obviously the judges, but also lawyers, also human rights defenders, prosecutors, and so forth. And we've only been able to support the women judges. It would be great if we could have supported more, but we're a tiny organization, and couldn't. Other organizations have tried to support others, but none of them are working. And they have well run out of the resources that they may have had or saved up, pre 21. They've lost their voice. And sadly, some of the family domestic issues that may not have arisen while they were serving judges have now arisen. We hear many cases of domestic abuse. The families, the judges here are obviously also in touch with their families there. About 2-3 weeks ago, the nephew of one of the judges here, age about 18, hung himself because life was so desperate, and now she's terribly worried about, what's going to happen to the rest of the family. And there's sometimes mostly there was very, very little that one can do. So you just help the ones you can help, because there are so many more you can't.
So on that note, what do you think, what does the international community owe to these female judges still hiding in Afghanistan? I mean, something more than what you've done. What do they owe them? Do you think, in your opinion?
Karen?
If you could wish, what would it be?
Well, I'm always struck by the fact that when the evacuation was happening, particularly in the UK, we were kind of convulsed about the evacuation of cats and dogs. And I say this as a cat lover. So I've always been very disappointed by our help for Afghan women in general. And I think the support that groups like Anisa's International Women Judges and the International Bar Owners Association, and some of the individual women who've supported this financially has been amazing. What I do see is the Afghan women judges now being very active and regrouping around issues like gender apartheid, and Taliban crimes against women, and they feel very strongly that they haven't forgotten women in Afghanistan. So that's very important. However we may feel that we in the international community have let them down, they haven't forgotten women in Afghanistan.
So support them to be able to support people back in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
So this is a great opportunity to open the panel to questions from the audience, and I have some, so they're eager to ask. I'll start with the first question for both of you. Either and both can take up the answer. So one of our attendees asks, do you have any thoughts on the narrative that the Trump administration has adopted to say that women in the Middle East are oppressed? It feels like this is only causing more oppression through bombing. A little bit.
Well, in general, I'm wary about politicians talking about women's rights, because I do remember 9/11 and the justification for us taking action in Afghanistan in the first place being to help Afghan women. And I worked with a group of different Afghan women at the time, and I always had the sense that we would let those women down, despite all the progress that was made in those years. So I don't know what you do about that, Anisa.
Oh, I think Trump's narrative should be given the respect it deserves.
Yep, short and sweet.
Codswallop, isn't it?
So let's go to another question. Our next speaker thanks you for a really powerful talk and asks, how do you think we can stay hopeful in the current political landscape? Again, I guess reflection on what is happening, yet another war in the Middle East. What would you say? How can we stay hopeful from your perspective?
It's difficult, isn't it? I don't think I have ever been as despondent as I am at the moment. It feels like what we thought was part of our DNA, in terms of what we would stand up for, what we would respect, what we would fight for, really isn't. What I suppose the experience has brought home to me is the power of individual action, that it comes down to people at the end of the day, rather than, certainly rather than politicians, but even sometimes rather than institutions. It's maybe not as, effective is not the word I want. I'd rather that as a country we stood for these things, but even if we don't, as a country, we can still stand for them as individuals.
And I always think about the story of Anna, the Polish lawyer that you were talking about, Anisa. So although Anna was a lawyer, she wasn't a human rights lawyer. And she was literally on holiday, sitting at home, reading a magazine, read this story and said, I'm going to do something about this. But she had no contacts, no knowledge about what to do. And because of her efforts, she brought plane loads of Afghan women and their families to Poland and supported them for a year and more in Poland. I mean, amazing. That's
Absolutely.
one person.
The actions of one person, she galvanized people around her, but it was started by one person. And you're absolutely right. It's been, transformational for those people. And I said earlier, our priority was the Hazaras, and the first group of Hazaras who came to Poland.
Go figure.
Go figure.
Yeah. So Zoe asks, first, thanks you for this fascinating discussion and for sharing this work. And she's asking, how can we currently help make things better for women in Afghanistan?
Since all of this happened, there have been so many conferences and fora and discussions and resolutions and so forth. It's just not high enough on anyone's priority. And I say anyone, I mean anyone who is willing to stand up for these people and really make a difference, as opposed to sign up to another resolution. I don't know. I don't think I know the answer to this one. Karen, I don't know whether you have any thoughts. I don't see an easy way out. Some of the Afghan judges, by the way, have said, the Taliban, they're just boys, they won't last forever. So regime change, I suppose, is one thing one can hope for. But I suspect it'll have to come internally. And women who stand up, women in Afghanistan today who stand up to the Taliban are completely crushed. There is no active movement of women in Afghanistan. They have tried and they have been utterly crushed. So I don't know where the resistance, where the change is going to come from, but one thing we know, nothing lasts forever.
Yeah, it's just unfortunate that Afghanistan has had changes with constant revolution that always puts the society back. And one would
it's a
hope
whole
that-
generation that it's the women today and the girls growing up in Afghanistan, that will have been sacrificed as a result.
Karen, are you aware of any specific institutions undertaking work in the United Kingdom for women in Afghanistan, apart from the one that you write about? Are there other nonprofits or any other institutional work?
Well, I know that there are universities who've been working with some Afghan women and girls, or were working underground to help them continue their education. That was a couple of years ago. And I know that, there are people who are working on particularly the campaign towards gender apartheid. So, yeah, certainly, it's interesting that there's been, I think, a really good reception for this book in the UK and other countries. And despite all of the effort of the American judges, who have really done so much over so many years, I think there's been a lot less interest in the US because there's just so many other things happening over there. As Anisa said, the Afghan women judges themselves, particularly the older ones, they have seen a lot of this before. They've been through the Taliban before, and they certainly believe, as Anisa said, this period won't last. But that will be more geopolitical change rather than resistance from within. And of course, changes of government usually mean war and fighting and loss of life and more refuge and more horrors. So that's not straightforward either.
And what we're seeing in the West now is the reluctance to recognize the Taliban, in part because of their treatment of women, like, who was this a surprise to? But leaving that aside, their reluctance to recognize the Taliban is now giving way to pragmatic concerns because they want to repatriate Afghan refugees. And so for that, they need the support of the Taliban. And now they're talking to the Taliban. So, women's rights have again taken second or third or fourth place because they want to be able to return Afghans to Afghanistan. So from saying we won't deal with the Taliban because, amongst other things, how dreadfully they're treating women, now we're talking to them again.
Yeah. Well, it's a hard decision. I'm just wondering if you do talk to them, maybe you can push for change. I don't know if that's a cop out or not. We had another question on that, what's happening now in Afghanistan? And one of the questions was, what education do women and girls now receive in Afghanistan after August 2021? Is there any, or it's all dead?
Go ahead, Karen.
Well, we've seen increasing restriction. So women are not allowed to go to university. They're not allowed to go to secondary school, and sort of their restrictions are gradually getting stricter and stricter on education and in any education. I apologize, it's a terrible echo.
I was wondering also, I mean, so the judges aren't judging, no women in the judicial system. Are there female doctors or nurses that help women? And are they allowed to complete their education and training to carry out jobs like that, if not in the judicial system, or is that also gone?
It's increasingly been restricted since the Taliban have come into power. All the restrictions have been against women doing the jobs that they had been doing previously. So you can't have women doctors anymore, you can't have women nurses, and yet women patients can't be seen by male doctors. Yeah. So you've got real contradictions there. They've even restricted women working for international organizations, whether distributing food or supporting other women. And given that restrictions on men supporting women, if women can't support women, then the women are unsupported. And, the pace of restrictions has not eased. And, there are really very few areas where women can now work. It also means, of course, that they can't earn, and if there is no male breadwinner in the family, then
they starve.
They
Yeah.
starve. Yeah.
It just seems to me like, I don't know, it's a little bit extreme, but really a genocide. And yet, on half of the population of an Afghanistan, and yet that was never going to be called or considered. As you and some said, now they're talking to them, and yet no strong stance has been taken on having half of the population of a country be so utterly suppressed. I don't think there is a society currently in the world that has that level of suppression. Correct me if I'm wrong.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And given their recent past, where they, had the opportunity and took the opportunity, we know what they're capable of. Even in a conservative society, so many women did so well. So given the opportunity, their contribution to society as a whole was tremendous.
Yeah. So as I wanted to give you a bit of a chance to say, what is the message that, I mean, this is an amazing book, and I encourage everybody to read it. I enjoyed it utterly, but I wanted both of our panelists to tell us what is the message that you want to reach the audience today and anybody who reads this book? What is your hope this book will do? And what is the message you want them to remember? I know there's a lot of choices, but if you could choose, what would be one message?
Well, I'll go first so that Anisa can finish up. I think, firstly, we wanted these women's stories to be heard. We wanted to record their experiences. Also, as Anisa said, that note of personal inspiration. Individual women did these things to help other women. And we do make up half the population of the world. It would be nice if we cared about other women a little bit more. But Anisa, I'll leave it up to you to talk about the final effort that you're working on.
Yes, the effort continues, but very, very limited numbers. And now I suppose Karen's written the book, and in that regard, in terms of how the story is remembered, I'm rather more on the periphery. But in the UK at the moment, like in so many other countries, people have opinions, often negative opinions, about refugees. And I suppose I'd like people to look behind the label and to try to understand that these are people who find themselves in positions that they hadn't chosen. None of these women would have left if they'd had a choice. And there are real stories behind these stories that we can relate to, people who are aspirational, who want the best for themselves and for their families, who can't relate to that, and whose lives were upended, not because they were seeking, better economic opportunities elsewhere. I, believe very much that most people wouldn't leave their homes if they had, a meaningful choice. And perhaps for us to simply be a little bit more nuanced, a little bit more live to the circumstances that causes a movement of people around the world, and not to, I suppose, allow the word refugee to be as tarnished as it has become.
Yeah. So true. For me, this has been really inspirational, and I think the message of what I want to say, what can I do? And I think that's, for me, was the main thing of the book is what can I do, and not wait. What should the institution or country do make a big difference? And thank you both for first, Karen, for writing this book. Anissa, to you and all of your sisterhood who really made, not only saved other sisters in Afghanistan, but actually created such an inspirational message of do it yourself, start on small things. And thank you for taking the time for this discussion, which was for me, very thought-provoking, and I'm sure for our audience too. Thank you for answering all the questions, and for the great questions from the audience. And I would like to thank not only our panelists, but also thank all of you for attending today's event. And please be sure to check out what else is coming up in the festival's program, which is on only until Friday, I've been told, which I'm sorry to hear. But again, Anissa, Karen, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.